Good morning. Today we're going to look at quite a few Psalms, 5 of them, from Psalm 61 to 65, with 2 from yesterday and the 3 from today. And Psalm 61 begins King David, maybe he wasn't king when he wrote it, I don't know, but hear my cry, O God, listen to my prayer, and then lead me to the rock that is higher than I. And we're going to hear that in Psalm 62, he is my rock. And again, verse 6, he is my rock and my salvation. And just that reminder that, God is solid. There is substance to God. And we can count on him. And when we stand on him, on Christ the solid rock I stand, we know that we have firm footing. We don't have to worry about sliding and dropping into the quicksand or the mucky mess of everything else, but the rock on whom I trust. Your rock is higher than I, you are my refuge. And then let me abide in your tent, find refuge under the shelter of your wings again. And that imagery of shelter under the wings is just commonly repeated throughout the Psalms in different places. And I've commented on it before, and I just, it's one of those images of safety, security, of being protected, by someone else. And then verse 6 is prolong the life of the king. May his years endure to all generations. So, and nobody can tell you for sure if he's praying for King Saul, or if he's praying for himself as king, or if he's praying for the kings that come after him, that they're, all of the kings of Israel. Long live, prolong the life of the king. May his years endure to all generations. And, for all generations, that's a long time. So maybe this prolong the life of the king, he's talking about, God himself, that God's reign. Just a random thought that I had, prolong the life of the king throughout all generations, because, one king isn't going to live for more than, like 2 or, just don't have very many generations live under one king. And then it ends with, I will praise your name always and pay my vows day after day. And Psalm 62 again, I read verse 2, he alone is my rock and salvation, my fortress. And that's repeated in verse 6. I shared that as well already too. But it begins with, for God alone, my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. For him alone, my soul waits in silence. And we can cry out to God and with our voice, with our heart, with our mind. And, when we cry out in silence, the Old Testament lesson for next Sunday is God speaking to Elijah and saying, that I will pass by. But he's not in the thunder, he's not in all the loud noises, but God is there in the sound of sheer silence. And so it's just that reminder again of be still and know that I am God. To take that time of silence and meditation and that resolve that, God is. And he is that rock and salvation. And again, he says in here again 2 or 3 times, God is a refuge for us, that place of safety, security, that rock on whom we stand. And then, like verse 9, those of low estate are but a breath, and those of high estate a delusion. So it doesn't matter, if we're low estate or high estate. We're not going to live very long, and the balances they go up, they're together. And it's just, that God is there and so much more than we are. And in verse 11, once God has spoken, twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God. And I think we hear more than twice that power belongs to God, and that God speaks, and so often maybe we're not quite ready to listen when God speaks, when God calls, and when God shows himself. Psalm 63 says here that David was in the wilderness of Judah, so whichever. But O God, my God, I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you as a dry and weary land where there is no water. And I think about that, dry and weary land where there's no water. You know, in June, we were getting rains or, you know, showers a little bit, almost every 2 or 3 days it seemed like. And then July came and boom, you know, hot and dry. And this morning, since about 5 o'clock, I've been hearing thunder. Not a lot of rain, but some rain. But, you know, the dry and parched ground, you know, and we need that rain, you know, and, you know, it's this dry and weary land where there's no water. And we know what happens. You know, the grass dries up, you know, things just can't grow without water. And even though we had some rain last week, some of the grass greened up, but there's still those places that just still are brown and need more of that water. The land is parched, and it takes quite a bit to rejuvenate that. Starting in verse 5 and 6, you know, my soul is satisfied with a rich feast. When I think of you on my bed and I meditate on you in the watches of the night. And the watches of the night were basically from sunset until 10 o'clock, and then another watchman from 10 until 2, and then from 2 until 6. And you think about, you know, if you were the watchman from those hours, you know, sometimes it's dark, and you know, they didn't have street lights all over, you know, then, but it was, you listened and you paid attention and you watched for shadows moving in the dark. And so these watchmen were, I mean, they were important because, you know, a lot of bad things happen in the dark. So the watchmen were there, and he's talking about being able to meditate, to think about God during those watches of the night. Some of those could seem quite long. I mean, to think about like 4 hours sitting there in the dark, watching and being aware. And in verse 9, those who seek to destroy my life shall go down to the depths of the earth. Again, that confidence that God will protect and that God will destroy the enemy. Psalm 64, again, hear my voice, O God, in my complaint. So, you know, he's going to get something off his chest, and we do that as well. You know, hide me from the secret plots of the wicked, from the scheming of the evildoers. You know, they shoot from ambush, they shoot suddenly without fear, they hold fast to their evil purposes. You know, King David had enemies. We know that. And some of those enemies were within his family, you know, when his son tries to take over, dethrone his father as king. But, you know, it's all of that. But in verse 7, with all of the enemies there, this complaint that David has, you know, verse 7, but God will shoot his arrow at them, and they will be wounded suddenly. You know, again, God will provide the force. God will be the protector of the king, of King David, against those who are his enemies in that way. Everyone will fear and tell what God has brought about and ponder what he has done. And again, that word ponder, I really enjoy that word ponder, because it invites us to meditate, to mull things over, you know, not just to read it once and be done. It's just like, you know, Mary pondered all of these things in her heart, you know, and it's just, you know, you don't just take it at face value, but you look for what's underneath it, what's underlying. And that's, you know, in that psalm where David prayed for the king. I mean, okay, he prayed for the king, and I wondered, did he pray for King Saul? Was he praying for himself? And, you know, so I did a search on it, and no real answer, but, you know, it's still something we can ponder and wonder about, think about. Psalm 65, praise is due to you, O God of Zion, O you who answer prayer. You know, and again, it's that statement of God's faithfulness. You know, praise is due to you who answers prayer, the one who watches over and leads and guides. By awesome deeds you answer us. This is verse 5. By awesome deeds you answer us with deliverance, O God of our salvation. You are the hope of the ends of the earth. And again, who can we hope for other than in God? You know, and sometimes we use that word hope as to, well, I hope something, that may or may not happen. But Christian hope in God, is that confident expectation that God does hear, that God will act, that God will protect us. And then the last verses, the pastures of the wilderness overflow, the hills gird themselves with joy, the meadows clothe themselves. It's kind of like, he leads me beside still waters. He, leads me to the green pastures. And just that reminder that nature, God is the creator of nature and the nurturer of nature, as well as the nurturer of you and me.